I think, especially starting off in school, there was a real lack of understanding about disability. So I remember being forced to do a lot of things that I physically couldn't do. So we would start the day writing the alphabet between two quite thin lines for me. And I would have to sit there and do it, and then be told it was rubbish, and then do it again. But an important thing to say is in a meeting with my first teacher, she said I would be lucky to leave primary school knowing how to read or write. So to be able to leave school with the highest in my year, and thereafter everyone was very accepting.
Harvey, welcome very much to Inspirability. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Oh, you are very welcome. Now, you have an incredible story to share with us of overcoming adversity, of immense resilience, and all the opportunities that you have taken and embraced with both arms. So I'm really excited to hear about that, and thank you for coming to share that with us. But first of all, I'd like to put it into context and for you to tell me a little bit about Harvey and your life growing up.
It's a very difficult question because I guess when you talk about who you are, you mean a million different things to a million different people. But from my point of view, I think there's a real Harvey you get every day on the surface. And he's a very happy, outgoing, positive person. But then you get the Harvey in the spare time. And in that time, there's a lot of work that goes into creating that person I am sort of out and about and in public. Growing up, things were very difficult. I think my parents won't mind me saying that throughout sort of childhood there was a negative sort of undertone. And that made life very difficult. Obviously, my dad worked with his hands. He ran his own garage. He still is a mechanic. He hasn't died of making it sound like he has. And my mum worked with dad, of course, very, very able. So to get your firstborn child with this thing called cerebral palsy, I imagine was very difficult for them. And there are handbooks, there is help out there, but it's all a load of rubbish, really, because everyone's an individual and faces things in a slightly different way. So, sort of growing up was a challenge, but we got through it.
So your parents, when you were diagnosed with cerebral palsy, how old were you when your parents found out?
I was around 2 years old. So my cerebral palsy, as it commonly is, was caused by an accident during birth. I thought it would be a good idea to stop breathing, just, as a bit of a laugh. And the nurses thought it was an issue with the machine, not with me. And it was at the very last minute I was delivered by cesarean, resuscitated, and then put in an incubator for a week on my own, and with only brief periods where I saw my parents. And I think looking back, although you don't remember it, that was my first week or two on this planet spent on my own in a room.
Very challenging start. And for your parents, how did they process it, and how did they then respond to the original to your diagnosis when you were 2?
So they responded in, I guess, quite an old-fashioned way, quite a tough way, but a way that I'm very grateful for now because it did pay off in the end. And that is that I would be treated no differently. There would be no adaptations if we could avoid it. I would do everything that other kids do. I would just have to get on with things. And as you sort of grow up and mix with kids without disabilities and they are your mates, I think things are very tough, but it is character building. And I, looking back, am so grateful that my parents took that approach because you see so many people with disabilities now who expect life to be handed to them. And I don't expect that. I expect to have to work as hard as everyone else to sort of achieve as much as everyone else. So that approach I'm extremely grateful for.
So for your parents, when you were born and then when you were diagnosed with cerebral palsy, did they know any other people with cerebral palsy or any other disabilities? Because what I'm thinking about is that perhaps back then there wasn't as much awareness of disability and support as there is now.
No, and that's a very good point. I'm only 24 years old, but in that time, the disability awareness stuff has moved on incredibly. Um, but no, in terms of people coming in and out of life, I did have a bit of interaction sort of in school holidays with other youngsters with disabilities, but apart from that, my parents had no real previous experience. And I think chatting to my dad as I grew up, he was quite open that as he went through his life, he had no idea about disability. Um, in fact, he maybe sometimes got into making fun of it, as people do, and I was the first disabled person that he had actually met and spent any sort of long amount of time with. So instantly, I guess as a parent, you have to go from this is my firstborn child, everything really exciting, to things aren't quite how we hoped, but we've got to find a way around that.
I think that's a really key message there, and that will resonate with a lot of our viewers and listeners, because it's about having something that's happening, like you said, your firstborn child, and you have visions around how that's going to be and how you expect that's going to be, and then it's very different for whatever reason, and in your case, something that was out of everybody's control. So for anybody who is having to adapt to that, whether in your parents' case it was dealing, and in your case dealing with a disability, but in a wider context, people are having to adapt to a massive change. What skills did you draw on, and do you think that our listeners and viewers can draw on that will help them manage that?
At the time, being so young, it was very difficult to sort of draw skills. I think I was bumbling through life, going from one disaster to the next, quite unhappy. But it's the skills that you acquire over that period. So I would say sort of through secondary school, I had become still quite a shy person, but very determined, um, just wanting to achieve. And I think, a skill I have, and I do call it a skill, is to hold myself to really high standards. Um, it manifests as being quite tough on yourself, but I think that really does build progress going forward through your life.
So you mentioned school. So tell me what it was like going through school as a young child.
So primary schools, actually, I was very lucky to be at that school. So I was, to the best of my knowledge, the very first disabled student. It was a village school, so there was 112 people there in the entire school. So everyone was very close, and everyone sort of mucked in together. Parents knew each other, so there was a nice little bubble. And that for me felt like quite a safe space. There were sort of comments made and times where I would get picked on, but I wouldn't class it as bullying, I would class it as kids being kids. But I think, especially starting off in school, there was a real lack of understanding about disability. So I know everyone has fond memories of their first ever teacher. And I sort of have the opposite. So she was a very an older lady, we won't say old. And she probably didn't have a mind that was as progressive as other people. So I remember being forced to do a lot of things that I physically couldn't do. So we would start the day writing the alphabet between two quite thin lines for me. And I would have to sit there and do it, and then be told it was rubbish, and then do it again. And also she played a game called Who Can Sit Still the Longest is allowed to go to lunch. And I inevitably was always the last one out the door. But I must say, thereafter, everyone was very accepting. And I really felt looked after, looking back at that school, Clitterton, because starting off, people didn't know, but then people clued up on it. And I didn't feel like they knew more about disability in the end, but I think they knew more about me, which is often the more important thing. And through school, got a couple of learning support assistants. Uh, for the longest time, it was a lady called Miss Kirby, who also had a son at the school. And I think she's my biggest memory about that, because she just took her time to learn all about me and looked after me really well. So quite often it was me and her through thick and thin. But obviously I felt like the odd one out. I think throughout my time there, I only had one other person with a disability come through. So secondary school went to a mainstream school, but with a specialist unit alongside, and that was daunting. It was a lot bigger, but that sort of opened up opportunities.
So what was the difference for you in terms of how you felt between being at a secondary school with a disability unit and then having other friends who had disabilities, as opposed to being at primary school where you were the only child with a disability?
I guess initially I felt in between the two. Because a lot of my life have been very able-bodied focused, I sort of, it was weird. I didn't feel disabled enough to be in that unit, but I didn't feel able-bodied enough to fit into the mainstream bit. So I guess I spent the first couple of years really struggling to find where I fit. But you in that we called it the PD unit, and I started to work out that these people were as disabled as me. Like I was actually part of that unit, and when that clicked and I started to revolve around that and go, well, it's actually okay to have a disability. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Things became a lot easier for a couple of years, and then a lot harder towards the end.
I think hearing your story, it's wonderful to hear the impact, the change that it made, having Ms. Kirby and then having other people around you with either similar or different disabilities, but having that support network.
Yeah.
And it's something that we talk about quite a bit on Inspirability, is that importance of finding a support network. So how did you find that changed your experience or how you felt having people around you that understood and supported you?
It took a long time for me to let other disabled people in. But once I did, I think my life previous to that, my disability had sort of been something to hide and be aware it's there, but don't be proud of it. Try to overcome it. But being around people with disabilities sort of taught me a disability isn't something to overcome in a way. I'm never gonna get better. If anything, I might get a bit worse in the future. But that's okay. It's something to embrace, not sort of try and reject.
And in terms of someone who, say your parents, for example, if you could go back in time to when they received that diagnosis and they then need to know how to support you, what do you think would help either them or anybody who wants to support someone but maybe doesn't know how? What advice could you give them?
I think it's about taking that person's lead. I think a big problem growing up with my parents saying that this is the way we are going to look after you. You don't necessarily get a say in it. This is the way we're going. I think life is always a lot better with open communication, but whenever you're trying to care for someone in any situation, you need to take their lead. Otherwise, you're never going to have that positive impact.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear because you're right. We can often think that we know that someone needs help and that we can go in and fix it, but actually maybe we're not fixing it how they want it to be fixed, and that we need to listen to what they need and take their lead.
Yeah, and it is sort of twofold. If someone's physically injured or physically lacking something, by all means say you need to eat or you need to do that. But when it comes to the emotional and the mental, things become a lot more difficult.
So when we were talking before the show, you mentioned that you proved the teachers wrong, anyone who doubted you, by leaving school with some of the highest grades they'd seen for years.
Yes.
So how did that feel?
That felt really nice. An important thing to say about me going to Clearston is in a meeting with my first teacher. she said I would be lucky to leave primary school knowing how to read or write. So to be able to leave school with the highest in my year and to be able to have completed those exams and learn about science and maths and mainly English. I used to love my writing. It felt really nice and really positive and sort of set me up really well to go into King's.
So one of the things that we've talked about with other guests on the show, whether it's climbing Mount Everest or overcoming a real challenge, and in this case, having teachers saying they'd be lucky to leave school, be able to read and write, and then getting the highest grades. We talk about incremental gains. So maybe can you tell us a little bit more about how you managed to? It's a phenomenal achievement. It's incredible. How did you step by step go through that process?
No idea. Because I think with most things in my life, it's, I guess, one characterised by failure. So if I fail, I try to learn how to do it, or come back and try to improve that. Failure is not a negative thing. As long as you don't kill anyone, you're laughing. But also, it's just about working at it. And I was quite lucky. I think I did have a sort of, I was very absorbent when it came to particularly English, science, and maths. I just enjoyed it.
So one of the things we're going to talk about later actually is failure. So it's really interesting. We know what you've said. It's about the path to success. It's not the end. But before we come on to that, you had a really exciting opportunity when you were offered to go to Africa. So perhaps you can share a little bit more about that with us today.
Yeah, I think that's where my life started. I think everything we've spoken about so far isn't me. So this happened at the end of that secondary school, and back then I was very shy. I didn't really talk to anyone I didn't know, couldn't stay away from home for over a night, and the head of PD got an email saying we're doing this trip to Africa. We do one every couple of years, and it's for people who probably aren't in the best position to go and sort of learn more about themselves. And I actually didn't want to go, but I knew to sort of break that sort of status quo. It was something I needed to do. And I actually applied thinking that they wouldn't accept it. And then they did and invited me for an interview. And I went, well, I'm going to screw up this interview. I'm not going to practice. And they're going to say no. And I can say, well, I tried. But they said yes. And sort of 2 months later, I was getting on an aeroplane heading for Johannesburg, which even on the aeroplane I was undecided. Mainly because at that point I had a phobia of flying, so that was difficult, and I was going away with 30 strangers.
So you really, really were a long way outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, huge. And the only way I got through it is by not thinking about it. So my mind was somewhere else, and my feet were just putting one foot in front of the other, doing what I needed to do.
So how important do you think it is to go outside of your comfort zone?
I think it's essential. I think if you don't go out of your limits, you are always going to fail. You're never going to progress. And I think comfort zone is it is an interesting thing. Like, not everybody needs to go to Africa. I don't usually do things by halves. But it can be things as little as going to the shop or talking to someone new. Whatever you do that's outside of that comfort zone is a positive thing.
And how did you find that? I know you say you didn't think about it, but you still had that inner strength, that perseverance, that persistence, just to go to Africa, sit on that aeroplane, do all these things that, you know, the previous Harvey would never have dreamed of doing.
Yeah.
So what did you draw on inside you to be able to do that maybe you can share with some of our viewers and listeners today who are in a similar, maybe not quite going to Africa, but a similar situation of going out of their comfort zone?
Yeah, well, at the time I had a really stupid motivation for doing it. So growing up, I always wanted to be in the army, wanted to be a soldier. And it never occurred to me that I can't shoot a gun. I thought, oh, I'll be fine. But sort of looking at my life then and where I needed to get to perhaps be in that position, I knew it was something I needed to do. But also, it's just the biggest thing for me through that time was being able to disconnect how you feel and how you're acting. And the two can be disconnected. I hadn't really learned that skill then, but it's a really important skill to be able to learn because your feelings are there just to protect you. Apart from that, they're pretty useless. So to be able to take that fear out of the equation is really beneficial in a lot of situations.
So sort of compartmentalizing in a way.
Yeah.
That's what you did.
Yeah.
So how did you feel when you were on that aeroplane, when you were scared of flying, very shy, but 30 people around you that you didn't know? How did you feel? Because I remember you sort of saying before the show that you realised you had option A and option B.
Yeah.
So tell me about those two options and what you did.
So I guess sat on that aeroplane, I just cracked on with it. I thought we would be arriving back at Heathrow in an hour or two. I guess part of my brain didn't quite believe that it was happening. So it wasn't until we got to a place in Livingston, which was our first stop. Amusingly, it was called 40 Towers, so that made us feel quite at home. It was only when I got there on day 2 that it hit, like, oh, Jesus, we're in Africa now. We're sort of away from home for 1 month. The other big thing was I couldn't contact anybody. So that's when it really hit. And that's what I wanted, because by the time that had all happened, there was no option B. I was there for good. I just had to get on with things.
In the deep end.
That's it.